There are naysayers about everything in life, especially it can't be done, and resources to help us grow are always just complete nonsense, a sham, totally ineffective, a scam, call it what you will. And yet, can even a resource like therapy, no matter our questioning how helpful or not it might be, can even, quote, the most unskilled, unproductive therapist be of great assistance to us, at least starting out. And as we grow, we find better and better guides in general. Just like growing as a person when we first date. Or maybe if we have a first marriage, if we get married ever, it being somewhat problematic or ending in divorce. And did I say also with friendships? You might want to hope that we grow in terms of who we pick as friends, spouses if appropriate, relationships, and so on. Even in selecting books we read, and television programs to watch, or movies, and jobs. Well, why wouldn't therapy and therapists, or analysts for that matter, be the same thing? Or even religions, or denominations within a particular religious sphere. Why can't we grow in terms of upgrading where we get our sources of information, inspiration, assistance? Why can't this thus apply also to therapists, if we were to turn to such outlets? Well, I would mention one thing. Therapists, at least, are required to have, at least in the United States, a certain degree of training from a college, or so it is said by training, a certain number of courses. And these not typically done online, or at least not entirely. And so it requires, I think, a certain amount of being able to stick to something for a certain amount of time, a period of time. And this, in and of itself, I think, more of a credential than we might realize, or all of us might realize. We might think, oh, anybody can simply go to school 4 years, 8 years, 12, 16 years. But is that actually true? For maybe, perhaps, many people, or some people can't stick to anything for more than 2 seconds before going off to the next thing and the next thing. Their frustration tolerance might be very low. Their ability to handle anxiety and anger and relate to people and emerge out of their home, apartment, call it what you will, might be quite challenging for them. They might have so many issues with anger, depression, call it bummed out if you will, shame, that they can't do much of anything other than distractive activities all the time. And so simply sticking to something, anything, even digging a hole in the ground, and then at the end of the day filling it up, and the next day redigging that hole and doing the same thing over and over again. Any task done repetitively, any goal sought for any lengthy period of time, compared to just a few days, say, whimsically, impulsively, and then quitting, seems to me a credential in and of itself that is often overlooked. And I think I overlooked that credential for much part of my life. But of course, that is not a sufficient condition for maximal growth if we're talking about getting assistance from someone else, that they were able to stick to something for a period of time. Their intellect level may be questionable overall, mathematical skills questionable, and values. They may also be quite a perfectionist while being able to stick to something. All of these matters while able to stick to something for a period of time as a bona fide credential otherwise. Yet, what is the alternative? To sign on to somebody, to receive assistance from somebody whom we don't know their ability to stick with something or another. They may be thus what you call a fly-by-night operator, hanging out a shingle, business card, what have you, here today, gone tomorrow, as per a flash in the pan, it is said. It is very difficult to know unless there is some kind of proof that is quite statistically accurate that this person was able to stick to something for a period of time, and thus an admirable credential, especially these days. Now, my second contention is that the person will have had some degree of efficiency in mental processing while sticking to something to get grades above the D level. In other words, they can't just show up to class for 16 years, 8 years, whatever, and get a degree and manage to get above D's, unless their mental efficiency is somewhat better than that. And those consumed with anger, fears galore, may not be able to do this, especially at a school that is above Antarctica University, or Bubblegum University as they refer to it. Or at above average schools, leave it to you to define this, achievement is more than simply showing up and making some marks on an exam with a pencil, and it being weighed almost literally, the marks almost being graded by the degree of coloring on the paper, or the weight of the paper, so to speak. But here is the third point, I think almost the most important, as to why pursuing therapy is a watershed moment for any, regardless of where one steps into the whole situation, as to who one selects for a therapist from a brick and mortar school, say, or anyone else for that matter, and regardless of the price point, and whether the person is in a rural area or typically more often urban area, wears a suit and tie or a sweatsuit or who knows what, or doesn't even meet in an office but on the fly, so to speak, at the racetrack, coffee shop, what have you. It seems to me the element here is this, that perhaps Eric Berne put it this way, a psychoanalyst from the 1960s era who wrote, amongst other books, I'm okay, you're okay. It seems from my cursory exam of the book that he divides people generally into two types. Those who believe it's always other people's problem if they're suffering emotionally themselves, or interpreting their pain of a physical nature to an extent they're quite excruciatingly suffering emotionally also. It's always someone else's fault, such might say, by default, and that they thus only have basically cosmetic problems that contribute to their suffering, how they interpret it, and so on, meaning nothing to them as to their pain, their premises, for instance, let alone any component such as their gender or body type, I would say. The other opposite group, almost completely opposite, being those who say it's always my fault, who were basically raised this way, or maybe had a body type or gender, again, that made it so difficult for them to voice a contrary concept if something forced upon them by a parent or other. that they kowtowed to this "it's always your fault," bought into it. Hence a book I was reading a year ago by Dr. Les Carter entitled "When Pleasing You is Killing Me." Maybe this is analogous too, in some respects, to the concept in psychology, in America at least, of splitting. All or nothing thinking being another term from cognitive behavioral therapists. I would say all your fault or all my fault. A more complex view is much harder perhaps to maintain, because saying it's all your fault or all my fault is so much simpler on a data basis as far as handling the amount of complexity, the amount of data. So, I know from my personal experience, having had a career collapse at about age 25, that I always thought before then all my emotional suffering, which was considerable, and my poor grades in classes, was always others' fault. That including considerable anger, off the charts fear at times, and outbursts even. Always somebody else's fault, and completely. Yet when I collapsed financially from the realities of losing the career and ending up basically on the skids, going back to school a year later and doing very poorly academically, it struck me that something doesn't add up here. And I'm in such excruciating pain, and I can't solve it very well myself, and I'm running out of money so fast, and I have no friends, etc., that maybe there might be something I'm missing here. And so I turned for assistance from the quote professionals. And it was not that advantageous in some ways. I used to say for years, even decades afterward, that that person was quite harmful to me, in fact, in many a way. I suppose, amongst other things, I wanted a magic blue pill download from that person to be cured, so to speak, or fixed, or made far less suffering an individual, and overnight, regardless of the level of development of that person. But if I had not sought out that person, taken the step, not just of, quote, seeing a trained professional or therapist or anything, but the step of first saying, maybe it's not all other people's fault. Maybe I play some contributing role as to, call it your mindset, but I call it more your premises, your upbringing, training, your society, and what you bought into or didn't, without consideration. Noting I had been told 5 years earlier that I needed to think more for myself by a fellow person I was schooling with. Well, I didn't know what in the world they were talking about. That would have meant, as I see now, thinking for myself as per questioning what people say, the veracity of it, rather than, quote, buying the Kool-Aid all the time, or, quote, swallowing something hook, line, and sinker, or not knowing who more to trust and who not so much to trust, is to put it another way. But I took that first leap, and while I used to blame that individual who couldn't, quote, fix me, and overnight, for many, many of my sufferings to follow in life for decades, I do see one thing very clearly more than ever now, and that is that was a watershed moment for me when I shifted from saying it's always other people's fault to saying maybe I'm wrong about that and I'm going to have to consider that. And that was maybe the biggest shift ever in my life at about age 25, 26, to say it's not, again, all people's fault except mine, or all society's fault, and that I have no role as to pain in my life I would say, as a result of mostly my thinking, my premises, and vulnerabilities to ingesting wrong thoughts as per body type and gender. Call it genetic influences, I think, more than your brain cells and brain structure by far. Or what they call biochemical issues, by far. Subject to revision, of course. And my thinking. That was the watershed moment for me then. And we can blame teachers, we can blame ministers, we can blame, quote, therapists of the brick and mortar trained approach, so to speak, for not getting us where we want to and quickly enough, if at all. But it seems to me, two types of people. For I've seen this also in some close to me, that those who seem to make no progress their whole lives, or even get worse, so to speak, in terms of bitterness, amongst other things, envy, call it what you will, a whole host of issues, in fact, are those who to this day, even in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, say, it's not ever my fault. I don't have any faults. And thus, they never have read a self-help book even. They've never looked online for any articles even about anything about emotional suffering, other people's suffering, and so on. It's always other people's fault, perhaps to their dying day. I would say thus a very big portion of this was that some people are far more enabled than others. These individuals seem to have a perfect career in terms of never being fired or getting advancements or getting a series of promotions, thus, of never getting a significant illness, of never having a relationship go completely awry, of never being homeless, of never having a near-death experience, of never having had cancer, say, of, if I not mentioned already, a pension that didn't fail. Under all these conditions, it being all the easier to say, it's never my fault. Or maybe they have ways of controlling anxiety that don't come from a, quote, trained professional, such as Inderal, a beta blocker, or just a minimal amount of alcohol to take the buzz off, or marijuana, or CBD pills, all from the, quote, non-brick-and-mortar approved channels for controlling anxiety, and thus not contributing to a notion that one must have some, quote, problems, as they would say in some channels. I think then that's why I once heard my physician say on television, or on YouTube rather, as an integrative medicine doctor, that for many of his clients, the watershed moment for growth started when they became, quote, when they had cancer. My physician, shall we say my physician, not so, but at any rate, this physician that I see specializing in cancer. And so, once again, cancer being a wake-up call, and by many patients he accords the best thing that ever happened to them. Why would that be? Maybe because he sees mostly clients who have considerable monies compared to some on the bottom end, so to speak, of life when it comes to money department. So many of them were enabled enough, so to speak, with money to escape by life without massive suffering, to include, say, homelessness or other, quote, near-death experiences too. It took being unenabled by cancer, which in many cases throwing infinite numbers of amounts of money at, will not effect a cure, a complete cure, or a quick cure. Thus, for the first time in their life, they were unenabled from a variety of sources, especially any money reserves or pension in general, or relationship that stuck to the end. Noting, even, I've observed or read that in many cases males in America who lose their wife first, if married, die very soon afterward, perhaps even 6 months, say, or a year or two. I would say they suddenly became unenabled and unable to cope with life, and if they did seek help, started way too late and needed results way too quickly and didn't know exactly where to sign on, so to speak, for help, or didn't have financial resources to do the job in a more efficient manner, shall we say. So the upshot being, maybe even, is it necessary to see a, quote, trained therapist? From the brick and mortar approach, maybe it's more a matter of looking and saying, maybe I need to look elsewhere other than claiming I'm perfect or that it's never my fault. That could even mean picking up a self-help book or trying to go to church if that is your bailiwick. Or maybe you hadn't gone for many years and you wanted to experiment with that venue or switch to some other religion completely or take up mindfulness meditation. Looking upon certain people I know, particularly more aptly some relatives, I see those who say it's always other people's fault, as those who never purchased a single self-help book in their life, even up to their 80s now. Never listened to a single self-help tape. And I'm not thus talking at all about therapy then, in the conventional manner, or they never also ever pursued a life coach in the area of growth. Or watched a single YouTube on the topic, or read a single web article on such. Their mindset being, why should I? Because I don't need to grow. I've reached the pinnacle of where I can grow because it doesn't matter, growth. It's always other people's fault. Some thoughts to consider here about therapy from the brick and mortar approach, or saying in general, I'm going to look elsewhere for growth in terms of how I interpret my pain than simply saying it's other people's fault. Always other people's fault, and completely. And often from one source, what might say, a spouse, a boss, or, as they might say, blaming the establishment, or blaming a certain social class, or blaming a religion one grew up in. Blaming. Finger pointing. Thoughts to consider.